Welcome to episode 28 of the 3am Fear podcast. In the early morning hours of September 5th, 1982, a paperboy by the name of Johnny Gosch left his home in Des Moines, Iowa to deliver newspapers to his neighbors. The 12-year-old was usually accompanied by his father, John, as was their routine. But on that particular day, Johnny decided to go alone, and he was never seen again. Not until on the side of a milk carton. If you grew up in the US in the 80s and 90s, you might remember seeing pictures of missing children printed on milk cartons. But how did this program come about? And why was it discontinued? To understand the origin of this program, we need to go back to the 1960s, when milk cartons became the main form of milk distribution in the United States. With milk cartons being cheap and widely distributed, it became common for companies to advertise on the side of these milk cartons. And by the 1980s, there would be an ad or some kind of a message on the side of every single milk carton. But it wasn't until the early 1980s that the idea of using milk cartons to publicize missing children that became popular. Hello and welcome to the 3am Fear podcast. I'm Nikita Ferrao, mystery and thriller author. On this podcast, I talk about real crimes and real people. Due to the graphic nature of some of this content, listener discretion is advised. You can find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. Let's get started. The program was meant to raise awareness about the epidemic of missing children and the concept of stranger danger. And while the program's effects have been very widespread, there are at least a couple of success stories that came about from this program. Unfortunately, I don't have details of all the milk carton kids, but we'll be discussing a few of them in this episode. Beginning in the early 1980s, advertisements on milk cartons in the United States were used to publicize cases of missing children. The printing of such ads continued until the late 1990s when other programs became popular. If you grew up in the US during the 80s or 90s and saw a picture of a missing kid on a milk carton and wondered why was this picture there or why was this mission discontinued, then this episode will answer that. I'm not from the US and I was surprised when I heard about the Milk Carton Kids program. I had no idea about it. But as soon as I started digging, I started reading more about it, and that's when I realized that there is a lot more than just a program. There are kids who are still missing, whose cases are unsolved. And I'm going to talk about some of them in this podcast. To understand how this program came to be, we need to take a step back and see how the first child was put up on a milk carton. In the 1960s, milk cartons became the main form of milk distribution in order to replace the more expensive glass bottles. And because these cartons were pretty cheap to produce, they were cheaper to sell, and everyone was buying just that. Back then, you didn't have a multiple variety of milk options. So you were guaranteed that every house would purchase at least one milk carton at a time. It became common for companies near local dairies to advertise on the side of milk cartons. And by the 1980s, there would be an ad or some kind of a message on the side of every single milk carton. It is debatable to who was the first child to be seen on the side of a milk carton. But going by the information that I found online and the timeline of events that followed, Johnny Gosch was said to be the first. In the early morning hours of September 5th, 1982, a paperboy by the name of Johnny Gosch left his home in Des Moines, Iowa to deliver newspapers to his neighbors. The 12-year-old was usually accompanied by his father, John, as was their routine. But on that particular day, Johnny decided to go alone, and he was never seen again. Not until on the side of a milk carton. At that time, Johnny was 5'7" and weighed 140 pounds. He had light brown hair and blue eyes. He had freckles on his face, a gap in his front teeth, a birthmark on his left cheek, and a horseshoe-shaped scar on his tongue. According to a Des Moines Tribune story on September 7, 1982, Johnny, the youngest of the 3 Gosch children, was well liked by his schoolmates. He played football and took karate lessons. He was a 7th grader at Indian Hills Junior High School. Around other students, he was known to speak out against drug use. However, that particular morning, Johnny had other plans. The night before, he had asked his father if he could go out alone. But his father refused, saying that he was too young. But despite this, Johnny decided to go alone anyway. He quietly slipped out of the house, taking his bicycle and his family dog with him. As the morning progressed, people began to call the paper, saying that they have not received their daily paper. Johnny's father soon realized that his son was missing. But he didn't think that something may have happened to Johnny. He just thought that maybe Johnny went somewhere. 2 blocks away from their home, he found Johnny's red wagon and bicycle. It was tipped over on the sidewalk. According to the police report, John picked up where Johnny had left off and finished the delivery. Meanwhile, the dog made her way back home, but all alone. Nobody had seen or heard from Johnny for hours. Johnny's mother, Noreen, called the police to report his disappearance, but they informed her that the policy dictated someone couldn't be considered missing until 72 hours had passed, even if that someone was a 12-year-old boy. So now Noreen had to wait for 72 hours before she could go to the police again. As far as the Des Moines police were concerned, Johnny had run away. At least 2 other people, another paperboy, and John Rossi, a father who had been helping his son that morning, saw some oddities at the spot where the boys had gathered up to pick up the papers. Both of them told the police that they saw Johnny talking to a stocky man in a blue 2-toned car, possibly a Ford Fairmont. Johnny even approached Rossi, saying that the man needed directions. But Rossi knew that something was off. So he looked at the blue car's license plate before the man made a U-turn and left. Curiously, he watched him reach up and turn the car's dome light on and off 3 times before driving away. Was this a signal? Unfortunately, Rossi couldn't remember the plate number when the police questioned him. It haunted him for years to come, and he eventually went under hypnosis to try and remember this number. But all he could recall was that the plate was from Warren County, Iowa. On that day, according to reports, as Johnny Gosch headed north on his paper route, at least 2 other paper boys noticed a man following him. Then, a neighbor heard a car door slam and watched a silver Ford Fairmont speed away, leaving Johnny's dog and the red wagon behind. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Noreen became so fed up with what she considered a lackluster police investigation that she hired 2 private investigators to help find Johnny. She enlisted the help of Jim Rothstein, a retired NYPD detective, and Ted Gunderson, a retired FBI agent, among others. Noreen's team suggested that Johnny was kidnapped and forced into a child prostitution ring, though more official authorities say that there was no evidence to back this up. At this point, anything could have been possible. Was just the beginning. In August of 1984, another Des Moines area paperboy named Eugene Martin went missing under similar circumstances. The police couldn't draw a line between Johnny and Eugene's cases. Meanwhile, Noreen claimed that the 2 cases had to be linked. It was a time of deep desperation for Noreen and John. Their son Johnny was missing and they were willing to do anything to get him back. They were confused and easy target for con artists. One such con artist was Robert. Noreen and John received a letter from someone calling themselves Samuel Forbes Dakota, claiming to know where Johnny was. According to this letter, Samuel had worked as a guard in a motorcycle club involved in human trafficking. He claimed to have personally guarded over 200 children and delivered at least 30 to the auction block, including Johnny. Samuel said that the club had sold Johnny to a high-level drug dealer in Mexico. He asked for $11,000 in ransom money to give them information about Johnny's whereabouts. Noreen wanted her son, and so she obliged. She sent him several checks, holding on to the hope that he would tell her where her son was. But as I said, Samuel turned out to be a con artist. He kept asking for more money, and the couple kept giving him. This went up to the extent that the couple had given him almost $100,000. The police caught up to Robert at the Buffalo-Canadian border and arrested him for fraud. He was only 19 years old when he was caught in 1985, meaning if we went by his story, he would be only 16 when this supposed club sold Johnny, and he would be only 13 years old when he was supposedly guarding Johnny. So it would be impossible for his theory to be true. Noreen believed Robert's story and she criticized the FBI for arresting him. She claimed that the arrest destroyed any chance of her son coming back, even though the cops kept telling her that it was impossible and that this person was just a con artist. Noreen didn't want to give up hope. The search for Johnny Gosch took a strange turn in the early 90s when an inmate in the Nebraska prison claimed that he had information on this case. His name was Paul Bonacci, and he said that he was the man who helped kidnap Johnny. Bonacci was serving time for an alleged sexual assault on a minor, but he claimed that he was a former victim of a child trafficking ring that abducted him and later forced him to help kidnap Johnny. According to Bonacci, Johnny was held captive for several days at a house in Sioux City, Iowa, almost 3 hours away from his home. The next time he saw Johnny was 4 years later at another trafficking house in Colorado. The Gosches were skeptical because Bonacci was not the first person to come to them and tell them that they knew where their son was. But they decided to test his credibility. The police had a rough composite sketch of the man witnesses described in 1982. When they took this image to Bonacci in prison, they laid out the sketch, and among them were dozens of other sketches. And Bonacci picked the right one. He said that that was the man who ordered him to kidnap Johnny the night before. And this proved that Bonacci knew something. Bonacci told Noreen things that he could only know if he had actually met Johnny. He mentioned the birthmark on the chest, a scar on the leg, and a distinctive horseshoe-shaped scar on his tongue. Everyone following this case knew about the birthmark on the chest, but the other scars, no one knew about them. Only someone who had actually met and seen Johnny in person could say that he had those scars. Bonacci even described to the couple that Johnny would stutter when he was upset, something that the public were not aware of. After listening to all this, Noreen was convinced Bonacci knew something, but the police still weren't. Over the years, Noreen continued to search for her son, hoping that any lead, something, would lead her to him. In 1985, she was given a glimmer of hope when a woman came forward with a dollar bill she had received as a change. The bill had the words, "I'm alive, Johnny Gosch," written on it. 3 experts and Johnny's parents verified that the handwriting on the bill was Johnny's. The media once again was drawn to the case. There was hope. Johnny could be alive. Noreen and John once again found themselves in front of cameras, begging and pleading and asking for someone to return their son. But their pleas fell into deaf ears, and Johnny's case remained missing. The following year, a man named Wilbur Milhouse was arrested. He was found to have a list of young boys, mostly their names and numbers, supporting Noreen's belief that Johnny was somewhere stuck in a sex trafficking ring. However, Milhouse was never officially connected to Johnny's disappearance. The case remained cold until 1990, when a body was found in northern Mexico, identified as Johnny's. Noreen was devastated. She tried to find closure, believing Robert's story that Johnny was still alive, hoping that it was not his dead body and that he was stuck somewhere in Mexico. The very thought of having her son stuck somewhere in Mexico would give her more relief than knowing or thinking that the body that was found belonged to him. Luckily for her, after further inspection, it was found that the body did not belong to Johnny. Come 1997, 2 men, one of whom claiming to be Johnny, knocked on Noreen's door, begging her not to tell anyone about their meeting. Noreen was afraid that Johnny would get hurt, and so she kept quiet. But not for long. In 1999, she was called to testify in a civil suit brought in by Paul Bonacci against Lawrence King, manager of the Omaha-based Franklin Credit Union. Then Noreen told the story about how Johnny had come to meet her. Paul claimed that the man forced him and dozens of other boys into child prostitution, and the case became known as the Franklin Credit Union scandal. That is a whole other story in itself. It's so horrible to know that such horrific things were going on. In 2006, Noreen found a stack of photographs left on her doorstep, showing a bound and gagged Johnny and other boys. She thought that this was a major breakthrough until the Des Moines police received an anonymous letter claiming that the boy in the photo was not Johnny. It was just some kids playing pranks. Despite all the leads and setbacks, Noreen never gave up hope. She always had faith that her son would one day return home. Johnny's fate remains unknown to this day. No one has seen or ever heard from him. If he is alive, he may have changed his identity, or someone who had kidnapped him has forced him to change his identity. Noreen's marriage to John ended in 1993, partially due to the kidnapping. It was too much for them to take in. But John always held on to the hope that one day his son would come back. He even took a DNA sample in case Johnny was found after he died and there needed to be something to prove that it was Johnny. The disappearance of Johnny Gosch became a big deal, staying in the public consciousness for the next couple of years. It wasn't until later that Johnny's face would appear once again on the side of a milk carton, among many other missing children. It was a quiet morning in Des Moines, Iowa, on August 12, 1984. Eugene Martin, a 13-year-old boy, was out on his paper route, delivering newspapers as he did every day. But that day, something sinister happened. Eugene never returned home. His family began to worry. They searched everywhere for him, but there was no sign of the boy. It wasn't until long before the police got involved. And this time too, like before, they didn't have much to go on. All they knew was that Eugene had been seen talking to someone at around 5:45 in the morning, just before he disappeared. The case quickly became big news, and people were drawn in, trying to compare the two cases, Johnny and Eugene. There were too many similarities to ignore. People began to speculate if there was a link between the two. Eugene's family was desperate to find him, and they came up with an idea that would change the way people looked at children's missing cases ever again. To give you a little idea of who Eugene was, Eugene Wade Martin, or Gene as he was affectionately called, was born on August 17, 1970. From a young age, he was a well-mannered and reserved child, often keeping to himself. Despite his shy demeanor, Gene was an active youngster who loved playing sports. He loved football and skateboarding. Fishing was his favorite pastime. As the 80s rolled around, Gene's interest began to shift towards video games and television. He would spend hours playing games and watching the latest sports match. Or on Saturday mornings, he would watch cartoons. Although he was small for football, Gene still enjoyed the sport and always bounced back after a tough game. When Gene wasn't hanging out with his friends or enjoying some downtime at home, he had a part-time job. He was trying to earn some extra cash. Every weekend, he and his older brother Don would wake up early morning, collect the newspapers for the Des Moines Register, and then drop them off at their respective houses. Gene's mother Janice was proud of her son's hard work and dedication. She knew that he was determined to make the most out of the opportunity, and she always supported him. Despite his quiet nature, Gene had a bright future ahead of him, and he was determined to make a mark on this world. It was a typical Sunday morning on August 12, 1984. Gene was getting ready to deliver the morning edition of the Des Moines Register newspaper. Dressed in blue jeans, a red shirt, and a grey pullover, Gene set out alone at approximately 5 a.m. to make his rounds. Normally, Gene would deliver the paper with his older brother, but on that day, Don didn't want to go with Gene, and Gene decided that he would go alone. The Iowa State Fair was in town, and Gene wanted to earn some extra money to buy something for himself. Don had been out the previous night, and he hadn't gotten home yet. But Gene didn't want to wait. He wanted to drop off the papers as soon as possible. Gene's route manager, Paul Porter, had seen him early in that morning at around 6:15 a.m. Gene had his carrier bag loaded with papers. Porter assumed that Gene had taken a few papers to deliver and then he would come back for the rest. However, customers soon started calling Porter, asking him where were their papers. Gene hadn't come yet. One customer even saw a bag of papers lying on the ground and wondered if they should pick up one of them. But because Gene was nowhere to be seen, they left the papers there and then informed Porter about the same. Porter went back to the scene and found Gene's bag in the same spot that he had seen earlier. He tried calling Gene, but there was no answer. By 7:15 a.m., Porter called Don and informed him that Gene had not delivered the papers. Don began searching in the house, but there was no sign of Gene. He then contacted his brother, Ron, and the two of them started searching all over. The only person who had seen Gene that morning was a man named Connie, who passed by Gene sitting on a corner with his empty paper bag beside him. This was around 5:10 a.m. Connie waved to Gene, who waved back, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary at that time. The only two people to see Gene or his supplies are Connie, who saw Gene, and Porter, who saw the newspapers. Don told the register, quote, "We both have motorcycles. We went to the malls, we looked behind schools, all over." End quote. Unfortunately, despite hours of search, no one could find Gene. Don returned home, called the cops, and reported his brother missing. Considering just 2 years earlier, another paperboy, Johnny Gosch, had gone missing in a similar way, the cops now were worried, and they took this case seriously compared to how Johnny's case was taken. 6 tactical unit officers were called in to lead and assist 5 detectives in searching for the boy. The day after Eugene Martin disappeared, Sergeant William Mullins of the Des Moines Police Department spoke to the newspaper to discuss the search efforts. Mullins revealed that in addition to police officers, they also had local volunteers, including the City Capital Knights football team, all looking for Gene. Within hours of Gene's disappearance, his information had been passed to other departments, and authorities were utilizing all available resources trying to locate him. The search began at approximately 8:40 a.m., just over 3 hours after the last sighting of Gene. The search was citywide, with information being made available to all cars on the street. As I said, the search for Gene was in full force because the police didn't want to make the mistake that they did with Johnny. They didn't wait 72 hours. The initial search focused on the southwest area of the city, where Gene's newspaper bag had been found. It was believed that Gene was likely still in the area, or at least that's what they hoped. Authorities initially weren't sure what they were dealing with. Was it just a simple boy gone lost, or did someone come and kidnap him? Even if someone kidnapped him, did they take him by walk? Or what if they took him by car? He could be in a completely different city by now. There were too many unanswered questions. Barbara Mack, general counsel for the newspaper, expressed her frustration and concern with the situation. The paper had instituted a career safety training program, which hoped to avoid such situations. In response to Gene's disappearance, the newspaper offered a $5,000 reward for any information relating to the boy. The reward increased to $25,000 by the very next day. Notices were placed inside the newspaper about Gene's disappearance. An additional warning was also inserted asking all children to be careful. Supervisors from the paper were sent out to watch other carriers while they were delivering newspaper. There was a moment of consideration during this period where this question came up whether Gene had run away from his home. But Sergeant Mullins quickly ruled this out. Within hours of the search, police felt confident they were dealing with foul play and were treating it as an abduction. During the search, officers went door to door asking Gene's route, asking residents if they had seen him or anything unusual. One resident reported seeing Gene wave back at his route manager, Connie, but there were no other leads. However, two concerning pieces of information surfaced. Firstly, a green car in poor condition had been spotted near the area of 14th and 18th Street that morning. This was where Gene would have reported to work. The car was driven by a white man in his late 20s or early 30s with short, dark, parted hair and 2 or 3 days of beard growth. The driver had been reported for possibly following 2 young women in that area at that time. The car was last seen at approximately 5 a.m., around the time that Gene would be getting back to work. Although the police had no evidence linking this man to Gene's disappearance, they were interested in speaking with him, finding out if he knew something. The second witness was an unidentified man who was seen speaking to Gene the morning that he vanished. While the exact time of this conversation is unknown, it is believed to have taken place anywhere between 5:15 and 5:45 a.m. The witness described the man as dressed in light-colored clothing and having a friendly conversation with Gene. But the witness was not close enough to hear what this conversation was. The description of the man was vague, making it difficult for the police to track him. The police issued a notice to be on the lookout for a white male between 30 and 40 years old, standing between 5 feet 9 and 6 feet tall, with medium build and medium length hair, clean shaven and neat in appearance. I know it sounds vague, and it did to others too, because the police started receiving dozens of phone calls. They were frustrated. People started giving witness descriptions. As I said, the police knew very well what they had done when Johnny went missing. To prevent repeating what they did with Johnny, they kept their lines open and asked anyone and everyone who had seen this man or anything suspicious to call them and tell them. This time, the police reached out to federal authorities for assistance, and Special Agent Herbert Hawkins of the FBI's Omaha office brought 16 agents to Des Moines to help them with the search. The news of Gene's disappearance was spread through local newspapers, radio and television, resulting in numerous calls to the department. The FBI and Des Moines police worked to track down any possible lead. As the search expanded to include isolated locations throughout the city, including parks, warehouses, and riverfronts, the team grew to include 25 Des Moines police officers, 16 FBI agents, and local volunteers, friends, and family. However, despite this expanded team search radius, the police were still frustrated with lack of leads. Nonetheless, they still continued looking. On Monday, the 13th, the police established a hotline so that if anyone had any tips on the case, they could contact them. The police did receive a lot of calls, but unfortunately, most of them were about people giving the police advice on how to find the boy. Or there were some special fortune readers who were calling and telling that they had seen something. Now, when it comes to such cases, people want to help the cops. And I really like that. I really like that people want to go forward and help them, especially when children are involved. The more, the merrier. But sometimes, some tips could waste time and delay the investigation rather than help them. And that is what happened with Eugene's case. Some tips were not even related to the case. Here are some of the tips that were given. A man stopped by the Martin home on the 13th and said that he witnessed a boy riding in a car near the 14th Street. The boy was bruised, and when the man saw Gene's flyer, he thought that this was Gene. But it wasn't. On August 14th, some witnesses came forward with the information of seeing a man driving a green car. The man was brought in for questioning, and he admitted to being in the area that morning, but he said that he was just dropping his wife off to work. And his alibi checked out. There are many such witnesses who came forward, too many to mention here. There was also a rumor circulating saying that the police found some blood in the location where Gene disappeared. But this too was just a rumor. Rumors and false informations like this were throwing the police around all the time, and it was just delaying the investigation. On Monday, local volunteers, including 2 boys from Gene's neighborhood and Gene's uncle, Roger Blanchard, organized search groups to cover more areas of the city and surrounding regions. Later that evening, police received an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to have seen Gene speaking with an unidentified man near a green 1972 or 73 Chevrolet Malibu with grey primer marks. The caller reported that the man had placed his hands on Gene during the conversation. Although the caller chose not to identify themselves, they hoped that whatever information they had given, it would come to use. By Wednesday, the FBI had brought in a specialist from Washington to interview the 6 witnesses who had seen the same man mentioned by the anonymous caller. They were hoping that they could create an artist's composite with this information. Law enforcement noted that the man was not yet considered a suspect, but they were keen to locate and speak to him. That same day, Gene's parents were scheduled to meet with Governor Terry Branstad, while the police continued their search efforts. The search for Gene had expanded beyond the city limits, with neighboring police departments joining in the effort. The Civil Air Patrol searched through the tall weeds and wooded areas southwest of the city, hoping to find some clues. On Wednesday, a pair of shorts and a tennis shoe were discovered near a location where Gene had last been seen. The discovery initially gave the police hope that they were on the right track. But later on, once again, it was determined that these items did not belong to Gene. The Iowa Newspaper Association chipped in to increase the reward for the information to $30,000, reflecting the growing concern for Gene's safety. Donald Martin had a meeting with Governor Branstad, where he expressed his gratitude for the governor's concern and personal involvement in this case. The family was granted access to this investigation, and they were able to meet with Tom Ruxler, the chief of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations. Reporters asked Donald about who he believed could be responsible for Gene's abduction. Donald replied that it had to be someone that Gene trusted. Gene would simply not go or talk to someone he didn't know. Special Agent Hawkins expressed frustration that there was not enough to work with to develop a psychological profile of the abductor. Hawkins explained that the lack of a crime scene and physical evidence made it nearly impossible to determine what had happened to the boy or who had taken the boy. In his opinion, the type of people who commit these crimes are usually introverts, loners, or people who had very few friends. As the search for Gene continued, the situation grew increasingly desperate. By Thursday, Volunteers and police were scouring the city and surrounding areas, sifting through garbage cans and dumpsters, hoping to find anything connected to this case. All bags were cut open and searched through before placing in new bags, and the police even rode along the garbage trucks, making sure that no potential information was lost. In total, more than 4,800 homes trash was examined, but unfortunately, nothing was found. In an effort to expand the search, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were brought in. They worked closely with the local police and distributed flyers throughout their network. The local police also launched a new effort to establish a standard program to ensure the safety of paper carriers, notifying that paper carriers were at a higher risk because these children were usually up when everyone else is sleeping, so they were at a higher risk when they are roaming out in the quiet streets. August 17th marked Jean's 14th birthday, but instead of a celebration, there was only hope for his safe return. Jean's parents kept themselves busy communicating with investigators and working to draw more attention to this case. Jean's birthday cake was placed in a freezer. It was said that they would only remove and cut it when Jean would come back home. Sergeant Mullins assured the register that no officer had been pulled from the investigation. In fact, all days off had been cancelled for the upcoming week to make sure that there was more manpower involved. A local grocery chain joined the effort, producing shopping bags featuring images of Jean and Johnny Gosch at the same time. They wanted to spread awareness among people. So along with Jean, Johnny was also getting the attention that he deserved. However, as time passed, the number of volunteers started to decrease. People were getting frustrated, they were not able to find any leads, and volunteers started dropping off. Sergeant Mullins appealed for more and more volunteers to come and help them. But people had somewhat given up. A significant amount of time had passed, and people had given up hope that Jean would ever come back home. There were also a need for volunteers to do extensive search outside the town, which was kind of difficult because people had to do their work, and so they didn't have that much of free time to go about helping. When asked about the investigation's progress, Mullins shared with the Quad City Times that there was a common belief among investigators that individuals with crucial information had yet to come forward. By the 23rd, the number of search and rescue volunteers had fallen and less people started to show up. There was nothing the police could do. This was volunteer work. The case was growing cold by the day. Rewards were being offered. Churches mentioned Jean's case, hoping their congregations could volunteer. But by now, no one wanted to come forward. In early September, the reward amount rose to $111,000, raising hope that someone with information would come forward to take this money. However, the start of the new month brought painful memories to the Gosch family. It marked 2 years since their son Johnny had gone missing the exact same way. The family expressed their frustration, still not having found any information on Johnny. By February of 1985, the Martin family was struggling financially due to their extensive efforts to locate their missing son. They had hired private investigators, consulted psychics, and even placed newspaper ads. Jean's mother expressed frustration over the police's alleged ignorance of over 150 tips provided by psychics. But how could the police believe psychics? As time passed, with no news, developments, tips, or leads, the Martin family's despair grew. They became suspicious of every situation, and even Donald admitted that they were quite paranoid. The family held multiple yard sales and mixed that money with donations to continue funding for the search of their son. As time went on, the money was going out faster than information was coming in. On March 29, 1986, a year and a half after Gene's disappearance, another boy went missing from the streets of Des Moines. 13-year-old Mark James Warren left his home on Emma Avenue to visit a friend, but he never returned. Very few details are available about Mark's case, although it appears that investigators initially considered him a runaway, but later on they realized that he had gone missing. Donald Martin passed away at the age of 65 after battling Alzheimer's disease and colon cancer. Despite his health issues, those who knew him said that he remained devoted to finding his son Gene at any cost. Friends and family members report that Gene's case became Donald's life, causing him to withdraw from others. He dedicated all his spare time to finding Gene. Sadly, Gene's mother Janice passed away a few years earlier due to complications related to diabetes. Both parents went to their graves without ever knowing what happened to their son. There are a few questions that were raised when Gene and Johnny's cases were put side to side. Were they abducted by the same person? Or were they abducted by different people and it was just a coincidence that it was the same way? Some people believe that only Johnny and Gene were abducted by the same person. But why the 2-year gap? Did the person strike somewhere else, then come back to the town and take another boy? Was it just that the police did not realize that maybe someone else was missing in another location? Both vanished around the same time, doing the exact same thing. Both were reported missing when customers complained of not receiving their morning paper. Or could it be that someone was inspired by Johnny's story and decided to recreate whatever happened to Johnny and pick Gene? Was this some sick, twisted game? In my opinion, it doesn't sound like a planned attack, and here is why. Both boys were not supposed to be alone when they were kidnapped. It was just by sheer coincidence that Johnny decided to leave before his father got up and Gene decided to go without his brother. So unless there was someone out there who had so much time and patience that they were waiting every single day, hoping that one day the boys would come out without their parents or siblings with them, there was in no way that this was a planned attack. All in all, it could also be random. It could just be someone who was traveling around the town, saw this young boy alone, and decided to pick him up. It could also be someone local because this person knew much more than just to drive around and pick up a boy. Many believe that this abductor either lived in Des Moines at the time of the kidnapping or had lived there at one point of their life and moved to another town now. One difference in both was that Johnny had finished delivering some of his papers and his wagon was found tipped over, but Gene never got to deliver his papers. Gene's search started 3 hours after he was reported missing. So that means that the abductor had 3 hours to get away before the police caught him. Could this person have been in a vehicle and just drove off? 3 hours is enough time for someone to leave the town if they had a vehicle. Gene had a relative who worked at the local Anderson and Erickson dairy. Once again, we have to remember that this was a huge case and people were linking Gene to Johnny all the time. Gene's relatives felt that if people started looking at Gene's photos a lot more, they may start to remember something. Maybe they had seen the boy somewhere, or maybe they would see the boy somewhere. So they could immediately remember Gene. And in order to do this, Gene's relative approached his boss at the dairy and asked that instead of running their normal weekly ad on the side of the milk carton, could they put Gene's photo with his details and a missing sign over it. The owner of the dairy agreed, and for the first time, photos of missing children with the word missing rolled out in grocery stores. It was a simple idea, but it had a huge impact. Months later, in November of 1984, Walter Woodbury of the much larger Hawthorne Melody Dairy in Whitewater, Wisconsin, was visiting Des Moines on a business trip. While on this trip, he saw faces of missing kids printed on the side of milk cartons. He thought this was an incredible idea, so much so that he decided to make it as a part of his distribution in Chicago, Illinois. He approached the Chicago Police Department and told them about his idea of putting missing children in the side of milk cartons. The Chicago police also thought that this was a great idea, especially because it would help spread awareness and ease their jobs. After that, there was no stopping to this. Chicago began showcasing missing children on their milk cartons to raise awareness. A month later, in December of 1984, Stephen Glazier, the future senator of California, saw this in the paper and thought that it would be a great idea for the entire state of California. A statewide campaign was launched in California, and nearly every large dairy in the state began putting missing children on the side of their milk cartons. Seeing this as a way to raise awareness for missing kids, the newly formed National Child Safety Council created a new program that will be nationwide and use a database of missing children that would be regularly printed on the side of milk cartons. This program was called the Missing Children Milk Carton Program, founded in December of 1984. The first child to be featured on a milk carton at a national level was Ethan Patz. In the next episode, I will be taking you through the story of Ethan Patz and what happened to the Missing Children Milk Carton Program. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. It really helps me reach new listeners. If you have a true crime story or a case that you'd like me to cover on a future episode, please send in an email. I'll link it in the description. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the 3am Fear podcast so you do not miss any future episodes. You can find my YouTube and social media links in the description box so you're always updated on what I'm up. If you love thrillers, I have a free thriller ebook listed in the description. Do check it out. Until then, stay kind and stay safe out there. See you next week.